Awesome. Thanks everyone for joining us. My name is Lucas Otomuro. I'm head of research at Into the Block. For those of you that are not familiar, in the past few months, I've been researching several of the emerging smart contract platforms as we see applications go towards more of a multi-chain universe. One of the most interesting ones that I've been researching is Algorand, which of course is the topic for today. So we'll get started with the presentation. A few pointers as usual. We will be recording the presentation, so if you're not able to stay for the whole webinar, feel free to check it out in our YouTube page. It's usually uploaded tomorrow. And as well, if you enjoy it, feel free to share it with people. Another comment, if you have any questions, so we already have a comment saying that am I the only one who hears not? Okay, it's working. Feel free. What I was saying is, if you have any questions specifically regarding to a particular slide, I'll be able to answer them as we go along. We'll also have a Q&A at the end, so I'll be checking those here in my second monitor every now and then, but we'll also have a more in-depth Q&A at the end. All right, so without further ado, this is the agenda for today. So first I'll start with an introduction to Algorand, what makes it different to other blockchains, what are its base infrastructure. Then we'll dive into some key metrics for Algorand. So as you guys know, at Into the Block, we like to take a data-driven approach into the research we do. Of course, we're an analytics platform, so we'll show some of the work that we're doing for Algorand analytics. And finally, we'll touch on the ecosystem that Algorand has been building throughout the past few years and the path ahead for it. All right, so let's get started. First with intro to Algorand. So what is Algorand? Algorand is a smart contract platform, as many of you will know. It was founded by Silvio Micali, who won the Turing Award, which is regarded as the Nobel Prize for computer science, for his work on zero knowledge proofs, amongst other things. It has a specific consensus mechanism called pure proof of stake, which is different from typical proof of stake and even more different from delegated proof of stake. I'll get into the intricacies of how it works right now, but essentially it's able to be fast, cheap, scalable, and decentralized. So it's essentially touts that it solved the blockchain trilemma. For those of you that might not be familiar, the blockchain trilemma is one of the sort of the biggest research issues that has been analyzed from multiple perspectives within the blockchain community for the past decade or so, really. So it's been around for a while, and up until recently, there's a few projects that have come up with a way to sort of get not compromise on either of the three. So it's called trilemma because typically the people say that you can choose only two out of the three, but you would have to sacrifice one of the three. And so Algorand pure proof of stake consensus mechanism goes for all three, and I'll explain how. So first and foremost, pure proof of stake, sort of as the name implies, it goes for the purity, I guess, the fairness, which is reflected in its highly decentralized approach, which I would say, based on my research, is the area where it excels the most. So it has the lowest. There's, of course, multiple ways to measure decentralization. One of those is the requirements to host a node. So, for instance, we see here a table comparing the requirements to host a node, which is, of course, necessary to be able to validate all the transactions occurring in a blockchain. And we see here that Algorand has the cheapest and lowest capacity requirements to host a node. So only 2 CPUs, 4 GB of RAM, and 100 gigabytes. So it can be hosted on something as simple as a Raspberry Pi, which of course isn't the case for all the blockchains considered here. Right now, with that approach, it has about 1,300 active nodes with these low requirements. And aside from the nodes, you also have several validators, which are people staking their own algo tokens in order to validate transactions with their stake. And the requirements for that are also really low. So you only need one algo. To be honest, I saw some places say 0.1 algo, but more credible ones, 1 algo. I don't know if it's something that they're updating, but regardless, it's still quite low barrier to entry. So 1 algo at the time of presentation, it's about $1.75 or so. So with just 1 algo, you're able to stake and be a validator and in the consensus mechanism, which of course is significantly lower than, for instance, Ethereum's 32 and many other blockchains that have a sort of higher barrier to entry, even though they have their own mechanisms to mitigate this. They also have the ability to unbond immediately. So there is no lock-ins into the proof of stake. So people are able to come and go on stake as they want. And I guess this speaks to the purity of it, is that it avoids the situation where the rich get richer. So rather than doing rewards pro rata, that is based on the amounts that's staked, they have a verifiably random function that randomly selects any stakers irrespective of the amount that they're staking. So essentially, if you're staking 1 algo or if you're staking 1 million algo, you have the same chances of being selected as the validator that earns the rewards for validating all the transactions. So that's in terms of the decentralization, and in terms of scalability, it's still quite impressive numbers all around. So low transaction fees. So it's around 0.001 algo, which is of course less than a cent, a tenth of a cent around. It can handle near instant settlement. So it has the lowest finality out of any blockchains that are currently live. So only 4.5 seconds, which is 1 block time. And that has some interesting implications that I'll get into shortly. And it can handle over 1,100 transactions per second currently, but it's aiming to scale that even further as, of course, the demand for high throughput continues to grow. And finally, with regards to security, it has several layers of implementation to keep the system secure. One of them is that through the randomness, through the verifiably random function, the stakers are able to be kept private, and they also change from block to block. So that prevents anyone colluding with any node, because it switches constantly. So in order to collude, you would have to get over a majority of the nodes, not just a select few, since you don't really know who is going to be validating, since that data is kept private and is verifiably random. So that makes it harder to collude. And finally, so that's more for the consensus security. And finally, for each individual validator, they have this interesting security mechanism whereby each node has a participation key and a spending key. So the spending key, you can think about it as the key that you use in your wallet to constantly transact. And they have a separate participation key that it's used to vote and to approve the transactions taking place. So those two are kept separate so that you don't essentially sacrifice the security of one for the other. So that's in terms of the base layer. A few other key characteristics of Algorand is that it's unforkable, theoretically at least. So since the finality of transactions is one block. So you can verify that after one block, the transactions have gone through and be confident that that's the case. There can't be two chains. And that took me a bit to wrap my head around that concept. But essentially, if there's a node that is trying to validate transactions that goes in a different path from what the consensus is, they immediately get pruned, so they get canceled. Not canceled, but the chain doesn't keep going because they don't have enough validation to say that that's the correct path. Which in other blockchains where the finality is multiple blocks, it actually can last for a significant amount of time. And if they get enough hash power or validators behind it, it can lead to the blockchain forking. I want to also clarify that this is unforkable for the base layer. Applications on top, which are mostly open source, can certainly still be forked. And since there is one block finality, this also mitigates one of the biggest problems currently with many smart contract platforms, which is known as minor extractable value. Since essentially there's less opening for reorganization, reorgs as they call them, of blocks over time, since you can tell with confidence that the transactions are final as soon as they're validated in one block. Other key pieces of infrastructure behind the Algorand ecosystem are the Algorand standard assets. So these are the equivalent to ERC tokens. So they have the fungible ones, equivalent to ERC20, and non-fungible standards similar to ERC 721 and 1155. Algorand relies on their own virtual machine, known as the Algorand virtual machine. So it's not compatible with Ethereum virtual machine, even though it has bridges. It has its own programming language known as Teal, which, however, even though there's like a barrier to code in that language, they have multiple software development kits in popular languages such as Python, Java, JavaScript, Rust, and a few more. All right, so I know that's a handful, and I see I have a few questions here and comments. So far, it seems like nothing's super related to what I was commenting, so I'll carry on. Awesome. So adding to the block, to be fully transparent, we've been looking at Algorand analytics, and we applied for a grant, and we're developing a set of analytics currently on parallel within the Algorand ecosystem. And as many of you might be familiar, these stem around network, financial, ownership indicators, which I'll be touching on today, but also more indicators that we'll be releasing in the near future, including social indicators, GitHub development metrics, derivatives, exchange order books. So we cover the whole spectrum of analytics that's relevant, not just for algo researchers and community participants, but also for traders and any person interested in the Algorand ecosystem. And so some of the key metrics that we're developing, as you might imagine, focus around transaction activity. And Algorand has witnessed a very strong growth in the number of transaction activity. So 3.5x growth year over year. They're currently processing around 150,000 transactions based on the 30-day moving average, which is quite large for algo transactions. For instance, in comparison, Ethereum does around 1 million or so, I believe, but of course it has a lot more applications. So for an emerging ecosystem, I would argue it's quite large already. It has also grown in terms of the volume that it's settling. So both in dollars and algo terms, it's showing increasing activity. So it's grown an impressive 36x growth year over year. And it's currently, based on the 30-day moving average, It's at an all-time high of 300, processing around average of 360 million transaction volume per day. It's increased particularly throughout the past few months, and has managed to stay quite high regardless of price dropping here in mid-September. In terms of how those transactions are distributed, we see here a positive sign that there's relatively equal distribution on how those transactions occur in terms of globally. So based on the times that those transactions are taking place, we classify them into the Western or Eastern hemisphere, sort of a heuristic to determine the composition of the participants in the network. And so we classify it as a global distribution, which shows that there's a global community behind Algorand, and that it's not just skewed towards one part of the world. Another key metric, as I mentioned, as I alluded to earlier, is that they have very low block time, so they can process transactions around every 5 seconds. So typically 4.5 seconds, and even during periods of high congestion, it's maintained below 5 seconds. And that's also the finality. So you can have a verifiable certainty that within less than 5 seconds, transactions are approved. In terms of active addresses, there's also an increasing amount of activity, so 3.5x growth, so from 20,000 to around 65,000 year over year. And there was a period of high activity in August 2020. I couldn't really find a particular reason, if it had to do with some announcements of them launching more DeFi applications. But so far it remains still below those all-time highs hit in November, but it were more sudden spikes. This of course is a 30-day moving average, but it remains relatively on an uptrend. In terms of addresses with a balance, so this is addresses with a balance, we see out of the assets that are currently supported into the block, and we support over 1,000 of them. So far, it appears that Algorand is the third largest, with the third largest amount of holders, which of course is positive. It shows a big community behind it. But to play devil's advocate, since there's the verifiable random function that gives each address the same odds of participating, stake, and getting validator rewards, it sort of does incentivize multiple addresses being created by by every holder, since the odds of getting that reward are the same regardless of the amount you're holding. So we do see that as staking went live, we see a sharp increase in the number of addresses, and it's continued to increase steadily since. One of the cool indicators that we have models for adding to the block is that we classify the addresses based on their profitability. So we borrow from options terminology and classify these addresses as in or out of the money. So for those of you that might not be so familiar with the indicator, we essentially look at the average cost at which they receive these algo tokens and put them into clusters. So you can also show the concentration of these. And if their average cost is below the current price, well, they're classified as in the money. And if their average price is above, they're classified as out of the money. And currently, even though Algorand, the algo tokens are at a price of around $3, it's managed to build a community at lower prices, where most holders, around 87% of them, are currently profiting, which of course shows momentum that it's building price-wise, at least, with that metric. Another sort of proprietary metric that we look at into the block is the number of large transactions. So we classify these as the transactions that are processing over $100,000 worth of tokens, in this case, algo. And this is a sign that we typically use as a proxy to institutional interest or whales activity, as we like to call them, large players. And we've seen a very, very promising increase in the activity from large players getting involved in the Algorand ecosystem. So 40x year over year, taking into account the 30-day moving average. And it's continued to grow over the past 3 months to levels much higher than they were, for instance, at the get-go, where the price was still higher than it is now. In terms of ownership, one of the key metrics that we look at Into the Block is a distribution based on the amount of time that these accounts, these addresses have been holding. And so we classify these as hodlers, which are the addresses that have been holding for over a year, cruisers, which have been holding between 1 to 12 months. So these are like the more midterm holders, and traders, which have been holding for less than 30 days. And we've observed that, for instance, here in April, when Algorand algo's price, I think, tripled, we saw a large increase in the distribution going to traders. But so far, it remains mostly among that midterm segment. And however, even though it looks small in the previous graph, we see a continuous growth in the amount of long-term players, so in the hodlers, in spite of volatility. So throughout this past year, Algo has incurred 2 or 3 drops of over 30%, and regardless, the long-term holders are showing like steady hands. So that highlights the conviction and long-term orientation of many of the players behind the Algorand ecosystem is growing. Okay, now finally, I want to dive into the ecosystem that it's building around Algorand. So of course, being a smart contract platform, it's creating the base for an ecosystem of decentralized applications to thrive on top of it. So this is a very important part. So Algorand, which has been live for around a year or so, the AVM, they just launched their AVM 1.0 version. So it's still very much in the early days, even though we're starting to see more and more applications being fostered in the ecosystem. We already have, Algorand already has 4.6 million ASA tokens, growing at a remarkable pace. Hundreds of applications building on Algorand and participating in the ecosystem, such as Into the Block providing analytics. And they have dozens of university partners helping out with research, amongst other things. So this picture from the Algorand website itself captures how they're distributed. They have a good amount of technical and infrastructure players running nodes, such as Blockdaemon. They have university partners from renowned universities such as MIT, where Silvio Micali was a professor, Berkeley, University of Waterloo, financial infrastructure. So they have, of course, a lot of backing by centralized exchanges. But interesting, as I'll get into, they're also developing their own parallel DeFi ecosystem. They also have a universe of applications building on top of them, which I'll get into shortly, into some of the most interesting ones here. So one of the things that are emphasized within the Algorand ecosystem is the concept of future fi, so the future of finance being decentralized. So in theory, not too dissimilar from the DeFi applications that we see nowadays, but built in a more provably decentralized, scalable, and secure way. And so they're sort of doubling down in this vision with a fund of around $260 million at the time of writing, 150 million worth of algo for a DeFi innovation fund. They also already have built bridges to and from Ethereum. I believe they also plan to bridge with other smart contract platforms. And they already have a few DeFi applications up and running. such as Tinyman, which launched just a few days ago. It's the first AMM. They already have a significant backing with large players and a good amount of trading volume taking place. They have Yieldly, which is right now the application with the largest total value locked, which is sort of a hybrid between the no loss lottery concept and staking for other tokens. And they're also having AlgoFi, which is a money market where people are able to lend and borrow in a decentralized manner. And so we see here Yieldly, which is the largest application in terms of total value locked. Also one of the first to deploy on Algorand earlier this summer. They have around 70 million with total value locked, growing from essentially zero earlier this May. In terms of NFTs, they also have a framework to support NFTs. So as I mentioned, the ASA tokens can be used for non-fungible tokens as well. They have the ability to easily create NFTs on Algorand. One of the benefits that they claim behind this is it can be significantly easier, cheap, fast, and since it's forkless, creators have more certainty that their NFTs will live only in one ecosystem rather than being ecosystem in the case that the whole base layer gets forked. And they already have a couple of existing galleries, the main ones being AB2 Gallery, from which I took this screenshot, and Rand Gallery. And so as you guys, as I've been alluding to, it's still early days for Algorand. It's targeting a set of key AVM upgrades throughout the next coming months and years, of course. The target, from what I read, is to increase the total the transactions per second to a total of 42,000 as early as this year, which of course would make it more competitive with some of the up-and-coming blockchains such as Solana, which processes 50,000, although in a slightly less decentralized manner. They want to also double down on their finality. They seem to be strong advocates of having that finality and block time of only right now 4.5 seconds. They want to reduce that even further to 0.5 seconds, making it as seamless as possible for your end users. And of course, the ecosystem is sort of thriving there, and they're counting on the deployment of multiple more decentralized applications over the coming months. So to conclude, Algorand is creating a base for infrastructure decentralized applications. They're doing so in a credibly decentralized way with their pure proof of stake consensus mechanism. They're doing so in a scalable way, so it's fast, quick, cheap, and secure, and it's cheap and scalable, and it's secure. So it's very hard to attack the network. Overall, the Algorand is developing a strong ecosystem. It's still in the early days. And yeah, I would encourage you guys to keep an eye out for the metrics that we're developing here in the blog. We're super excited to share those with you in the next few months. So thank you guys. Make sure to sign up for our next webinar, the evolution of DeFi. So sort of similar to what I was talking about today, we'll talk about how DeFi applications are going multi-chain. I know it's sort of a buzzword right now, but they're expanding beyond Ethereum to more blockchains. And we'll discuss how those dynamics are taking place, as well as some of the newer use case and applications being developed there. Thank you very much, guys. Now I'll stick around a few minutes for questions, which I see several already. So several questions. Glad you guys enjoyed the webinar. Let's see if the comments there. So we've got a few anonymous questions that I'll get into. So one anonymous attendee is asking, when do the investor vesting schedules end? The tokenomics has been a killer for Algo's price performance. I believe they have a long-term vesting schedule, so longer than usual. I do not know off the top of my head exactly when they end though. But I remember looking it up and it was relatively easy to find. So sorry, I don't remember off the top of my head, but you should be able to find it. And yeah, it's been positive so far. Another anonymous attendee is commenting, Algo seems to be positioning itself as the blockchain for CBDCs. How does running a CBDC on Algorand feed through into the Algo token? So good comment and question. So yes, I think they have a framework for being credibly decentralized to an extent that makes it, I guess, one of the contenders for the most decentralized blockchains. I would say right up there with Ethereum. A lot of the newer blockchains are sort of sacrificing that for more scalable products. But yeah, I've seen some traction. I believe also like Libra had a partnership, Facebook's project, which then renamed to DM, and then I think didn't end up shipping. But they were partners with Algorand, so I wouldn't be surprised, especially also given Silvius Micali credibility, that we see more and more CBDCs at least testing the waters with Algorand. So it's still early days, so we can't tell for sure, but I wouldn't be surprised. And how would this tie in for Algo? So, well, the gas fees to take these transactions would have to be paid in Algo, like with most smart contract platforms. So this would fuel demand as people transact on CBDCs or really any application built on top of Algorand. Anonymous attendees asking, so can Algorand and ETH 2.0 coexist, or are they direct competitors where only can win? So I think we're still in the very early days of what's likely to be a multi-decade trend for blockchains. So I think it's very likely that they'll coexist. Over 95% chance, I would guess, that they will coexist. Yes, there's a certain degree of competition, but there are some trade-offs that Ethereum 2.0 takes that Algorand doesn't. So for instance, with sharding on ETH 2.0, that composability where you build one app on top of another is sort of a trade-off that they forego. So once applications are in multiple shards, it gets harder and harder to build applications on top of another, like you currently can on the existing ETH 1.0 ecosystem. And this is a trade-off that Algorand does not forego. So you'll be able to composably build applications on top of another within the existing Algorand ecosystem. So it's likely that both and several other chains, in my opinion, will coexist for the foreseeable future. Guillermo is asking, do you have a statistical breakdown by organizations, or do you know how many transactions came from the project with Banco da Vivienda in Colombia? No, I don't have that, to be honest. And unless this bank is validating the addresses that they own, it's typically quite hard to validate those. But some organizations are transparent about the addresses that they're running in these blockchains. So perhaps you can find that. Matthew's commenting, nice presentation, thank you, glad you liked it. When I search for algo information on ITB site, I see no information. What specifically do you need on ITB site to display the fundamental factors you have shown today? Matthew, so what we're doing is we're sort of taking this as a midpoint of the research that we've been developing at Into the Block for Algorand Analytics. So this is an ongoing project. I shared around, I don't know, 15 or so indicators today, but we will launch the full suite of indicators at Into the Block. We're targeting mid to late November. But yes, it's part of the ongoing grant that we have with Algorand. So we expect to have these typical indicators as well as several more on Algorand that we'll be excited to share with you guys in the next few months. Another question. So Connor here is asking, in a multi-chain world, where do you think Algorand will find its niche? It's a good question. I think they're sort of taking an approach where they're not compromising on either of the three on the blockchain trilemma, which is interesting and certainly ambitious. But I would argue that the area, as I've hinted to, that they excel the most is the decentralization. And so I think they can take this along with the whole credibility and university partnerships that they have going on to develop credibly decentralized applications for a lot of institutions, existing and new ones that want to develop in the ecosystem. So for instance, I saw a partnership with Securitize, which is doing security tokens, which of course have been like a project in development for the past few years. But as we do see like the migration from, let's call it like paper databases into a digital world where the blockchain is the base layer, I think that Algorand is well suited for those types of applications where you have to show that you're credibly decentralized and still not sacrifice on the scalability and security, as well as the composability, as I touched on earlier. Aaron is commenting, it would be great if Into the Block could provide videos that explain how to pull this data. Yes, so we have a resources section. And we do have some older videos in our YouTube page that explain these indicators. So feel free to take a look at our resources section added to the blog. You can find it. You should be able to find it without too much problem. We'll also be providing more when the release is just a few weeks away. So mid-November or so, we'll also be providing more thoughtful articles diving into the Algorand ecosystem and how you can use these metrics, which is hopefully helpful. Kwang is asking, what do you think about the current development pace of Algorand compared to other quickly developing blockchain platforms like Phantom? Are there any signs of growing in the market wave? So we've seen GitHub metrics, which is of course one of the key indicators for development pace. We've seen an increase in those. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to share that because we haven't productized it yet. But I would argue that they're still growing and you're seeing an increasing amount of applications launching. I only covered the applications that are currently live, but within the image I shared earlier on the ecosystem, I'll go into it. There are, these are just tens of applications that are featured, but there's, I believe, hundreds of applications developing on Algorand. So actually some of the ones that I covered today aren't even included in here. So it's hard to tell for sure, but it does seem like they're getting a increasing pace of development in the Algorand ecosystem. Adjutor is asking, why does ITB not have data for the Binance chain? Yes, so it's another blockchain that we're looking at as we're expanding to multi-chain approach ourselves as well as the industry. Hopefully we can launch metrics for BSC in the near term. Right now, Algorand is the next target, but we have sort of this goal that every quarter we intend to launch more and more smart contract platforms. So being EVM compatible, BSC could be a candidate. So one last question. I'm sorry, guys, I won't be able to get into all of these. Let me see which one. Okay, I have a lot of questions. So, for instance, can you access NFTs through their web app? To be honest, I'm not sure if you can. I know you can link your wallet to the NFT galleries I show at AB2 and Rand Gallery. And a few more questions and things. To be honest, there's a few questions that are asking for my financial opinion, so I won't get into those. But anyways, thanks everyone for tuning in. I appreciate you guys listening to me ramble about Algorand for half an hour here, and hope you guys are excited as I am to continue covering the space and to release the Algorand metrics soon. Well, thanks everyone, and hope to catch you guys on the next webinar. Bye.